Welcome to the channel where we explore the most mysterious and little-known pages of the past. Today we will travel to an era about which we know very little, the Stone Age. When we imagine primitive people, images of hunters armed with spears fighting wild animals come to mind. This time seems full of physical dangers. But what if the most terrible threats were invisible? Archaeological finds and modern research show that the lives of primitive people were full of dangers that we cannot even imagine. Death could come not only from the teeth of a saber-toothed tiger, but also from invisible enemies that could destroy an entire tribe in a matter of days. We will talk about how primitive people face these challenges and how their lives, which seem simple to us, were actually incredibly difficult. Watch the video to the end, and you will learn how the transition from a nomadic to a sedentary lifestyle affected people's health and how the first settlements became hotbeds of epidemics. The lives of primitive people were full of dangers. Wild animals, hunger, and cold were all visible threats, but there were also invisible enemies that were much more insidious. These were pathogens that silently undermined their health. Constant contact with nature was both a source of survival and a major threat to primitive people. They ate the meat of wild animals, which could be carriers of dangerous diseases. The lack of hygiene and medical knowledge left them defenseless against infections transmitted from animals to humans. Even when processing carcasses, it was possible to become infected by inhaling spores or coming into direct contact with pathogens. Hunters and gatherers lived in close contact with wildlife, in forests, caves, and near water bodies, where millions of microorganisms lived. According to archaeological research, diseases caused by these contacts were very common. Another source of disease was the environment. For example, soil could contain various pathogens. They entered the body through cuts or the respiratory tract. Living in close groups in caves contributed to the rapid spread of infections. Even plants that seemed harmless at first glance could be a source of poisons or microorganisms. Despite some knowledge of flora, primitive people could not know about all the hidden dangers. The lack of basic hygiene, such as using the same water for different purposes, created ideal conditions for the spread of disease. And common injuries sustained while hunting often led to infections that, in the absence of medicine, could be fatal. Thus, the lives of primitive people were full of invisible threats. Diseases that seem commonplace to us today could be fatal to them. It was a world in which people were defenseless against invisible enemies. What else besides contact with animals do you think could have caused such diseases? Leave your thoughts in the comments. The transition to a sedentary lifestyle in the Stone Age, known as the Neolithic Revolution, had negative health consequences, making the earth a source of disease. Unlike nomads who moved around and left their waste behind, in permanent settlements it accumulated. This led to water and soil contamination, which contributed to the spread of infections. In addition, people began to live in closer groups, which accelerated the transmission of diseases. Their diet also changed. Farmers depended on a limited number of crops, which led to nutrient deficiencies and weakened immunity. Working the land increased contact with soil microorganisms, such as bacteria that cause tetanus. Domesticating animals also led to the transmission of new diseases to humans, to which they had no immunity. Thus, although a sedentary lifestyle gave impetus to the development of civilization, it created new health challenges that primitive humans could not cope with. What other aspects of a sedentary lifestyle could have contributed to the spread of disease in the Stone Age? We can learn this from the human bodies of primitive people. Let's talk more about the bones of ancient people. Archaeology gives us a unique opportunity to look into the past and see traces of disease on bones. Some diseases left characteristic changes in bone structure that can be studied today. For example, archaeologists have found traces indicating diseases that affected joints and bones. These diseases could cause discomfort and stiffness in movement, which made hunting and gathering food very difficult. In addition, traces have been found indicating diseases that cause bone weakening. People with such diseases were more vulnerable to fractures and other injuries, which could put their lives at risk. These findings show that even if a person did not die from the direct effects of a disease, it could make them vulnerable to other dangers. It was caused by hard physical labor and constant stress associated with hunting, gathering food, and a nomadic lifestyle. The skeletons of primitive humans show characteristic changes in the joints that indicate this disease. These changes could cause pain and stiffness, making everyday life very difficult. Another common disease, traces of which can be found on bones, was skeletal hyperostosis, or Forestier's disease. This disease causes ossification of ligaments and tendons, leading to stiffness of movement. Although it was not always fatal, it could render a person incapacitated. A person who could not move would be unable to hunt or gather food, which would put their life at risk. In addition, evidence of tuberculosis was found on the bones. This disease, which seems commonplace to us today, could be very deadly in the Stone Age. It affected the lungs, spine, and other bones. Skeletons affected by tuberculosis show characteristic changes, such as spinal deformities. Inadequate and unbalanced nutrition also left its mark on the bones. For example, there was a lack of zinc and vitamins, which led to weakening of the bones. This made people more vulnerable to fractures and other injuries. In the absence of medical care, these fractures could lead to serious complications. Even a minor fracture, which seems trivial to us today, could have led to a tragic end. The transition to agriculture was one of the most important moments in human history, but it also brought new challenges. People began to live in denser communities, which created ideal conditions for the spread of diseases that are transmitted from person to person. The process of domesticating animals became a two-way exchange. People gained a reliable source of food, wool, and labor, while animals gained protection and a guaranteed food supply. However, this close contact led to viruses and bacteria that were previously specific to animals being able to mutate and jump to humans. Some of the most devastating epidemics in human history, including smallpox and measles, are of zoonotic origin. Gradually, over generations, humans developed immunity to these new diseases. But in the early stages, this came at a huge cost. The population grew, which in turn required more efficient methods of food production. This cycle of dependency, more people, more food, more risks, led to the emergence of entirely new types of problems that our hunter-gatherer ancestors could not even imagine. As settlements became denser, the need for organization arose. The first forms of government appeared, responsible for the distribution of resources, conflict resolution, and of course, hygiene, albeit at a primitive level. Every technological leap forward in human history, from the invention of fire to agriculture, has always been accompanied by new, often unforeseen problems. Humanity is constantly struggling with the consequences of its own inventions, creating new solutions that in turn give rise to further difficulties. It turns out that in order to survive, it was necessary to invent something else. But what? And why does humanity love to create problems so much, only to then heroically solve them? Stay with us. We'll talk about this in a minute. In the Stone Age, people did not know that water and food could be sources of disease. They drank water from rivers and lakes, which could be contaminated with various microorganisms. They ate raw meat and fish, which could also cause serious disorders. Unlike airborne infections, which could spread quickly but sometimes left survivors with acquired immunity, diseases transmitted through water and food work differently. These diseases, such as dysentery, cholera, and typhoid, were particularly insidious. They did not allow the body to adapt, but instead affected entire settlements that relied on the same water source. The first evidence of the fight against these diseases is more intuitive than scientific. People noticed that water taken from certain places caused fewer disorders and tried to use it. They also learned to heat treat food. Heat treatment not only made meat and fish more digestible, but also killed most dangerous microorganisms. However, this was not enough, as water remained the main source of infection. Mass epidemics caused by contaminated water or food could wipe out entire communities, forcing survivors to seek new places to settle. It was a cruel lesson in evolution that forced humanity to seek safer ways of organizing life and interacting with the environment. Thus, the struggle for survival turned from a battle with wild animals and harsh weather conditions into an invisible war with microscopic enemies. This was a key moment in the development of human society, forcing people to think about things like hygiene and sanitation. In primitive societies where people lived in small groups, immunity to various diseases was poorly developed. When people began to interact with other groups, they became more vulnerable to new diseases to which they had no immunity. This led to outbreaks that could wipe out entire tribes. Why do you think immunity is weaker in isolated groups than in larger communities? Perhaps this allowed them to fight the smallest enemies of our world more quickly. We will find out very soon. Over millions of years of evolution, the human immune system developed in close connection with the environment and the microorganisms with which it was in constant contact. In small nomadic groups consisting of dozens or at most a few hundred people, the range of familiar viruses and bacteria was limited. If a new unfamiliar pathogen entered the group, it could spread quickly among all its members. But then, having exhausted its fuel, that is, all the non-immune people, it would die out. The situation changed dramatically with the onset of the Neolithic Revolution and the transition to a sedentary lifestyle. Settlements and later cities became centers where people, animals, and their waste coexisted in a limited area. This created ideal conditions for the constant circulation of pathogens. Viruses and bacteria transmitted from person to person gained an unlimited resource for their reproduction. People were constantly in contact with new pathogens, which on the one hand led to frequent illnesses, but on the other hand contributed to the formation of collective immunity. When these immunized populations encountered groups that lived in isolation, the consequences were catastrophic. A striking historical example is the European colonization of America. For Europeans who had lived surrounded by smallpox, measles, and influenza for centuries, these diseases had become commonplace, and most of them had contracted them in childhood. But for the indigenous peoples of America, these diseases were completely new. Their immune systems were simply not prepared for such an onslaught. When the conquistadors brought these viruses with them, epidemics wiped out up to 90% of the population, which is one of the most tragic consequences of the clash of cultures. Thus, the lack of immunity to new diseases that came with contact with other groups became one of the deadliest factors in human history. Why do you think immunity is weaker in isolated groups than in larger communities? Perhaps this would allow them to fight the smallest enemies of our world more quickly. We will find out very soon. Parasites were part of the lives of primitive people. They could be found in the food they ate, the water they drank, and the ground they walked on. In the absence of basic hygiene, parasites were a real problem. They could cause various disorders that weakened the body and made it vulnerable to other diseases. In addition, parasites could be transmitted from person to person, leading to their rapid spread in dense communities. Today, we have medicines and hygiene products that help us fight parasites. But in the Stone Age, people were defenseless against them. The life of primitive man was inextricably linked to nature, which unfortunately meant constant contact with a huge number of parasites. Without knowledge of microorganisms, people could not understand the true cause of their ailments. They observed symptoms, diarrhea, weight loss, weakness, but attributed them to mystical causes rather than tiny creatures living in their bodies. With the transition to a sedentary lifestyle and the emergence of permanent settlements, the situation only worsened. The abundance of garbage and waste that accumulated in the immediate vicinity of dwellings created ideal conditions for the reproduction of insect vectors. Despite the lack of modern medicine, people intuitively sought ways to combat this invisible threat. They noticed that some plants had anti-parasitic properties. In addition, people began to experiment with hygiene practices. This led to the emergence of the first, albeit primitive, rules of sanitation. For example, burying waste far away from settlements and water sources. Thus, parasites were not just an unpleasant addition to life, but a serious factor that influenced the demographics, social structure, and even the evolutionary process of humanity. In the Stone Age, wounds were a part of life. In the absence of antiseptics and sterile instruments, even a small wound could cause serious complications. The wound could become infected, leading to suppuration and general malaise. The most common were bacterial infections, which could cause sepsis. This condition, which is treated with antibiotics today, was practically a death sentence in the Stone Age. Infection often led to fever, chills, severe pain, and ultimately organ failure. Another deadly danger was tetanus. Even a small wound from a sharp stick or a piece of broken stone could lead to horrific convulsions and paralysis of the respiratory muscles, which inevitably resulted in death. The study of archaeological finds and skeletal remains of ancient humans confirms that injuries were common, but their consequences were much more serious than today. researchers find traces of fractures that have healed incorrectly or traces of infections on bones, indicating purulent processes that could not be stopped. Despite this, primitive people still had their own ways of alleviating suffering and helping wounds to heal. They used natural antiseptics such as charcoal, ash, or certain types of herbs that had antibacterial properties. They also learned to use leaves and moss as primitive bandages, which, although not sterile, could protect the wound from further contamination. The presence of wounds and their complications was not only a health problem, but also an important social factor. A person who had suffered a serious injury could be excluded from the active life of the tribe. They could not participate in hunting, gathering, or defending their community, which made them dependent on others. Thus, vulnerability to wounds and infections was one of the key factors that shaped life and death in the Stone Age, forcing people to constantly seek ways to survive in this hostile world. Primitive people were part of nature, but that did not mean that nature was kind to them. They were constantly under threat not only from predators, but also from the environment itself. This invisible war was constant and relentless. People who lived in harsh climatic conditions could suffer from torrential rains that seem harmless to us today. But in the absence of permanent housing, even they could be deadly. Every rainy season, every hurricane, and every drought was a test of endurance, where the price of a mistake was incredibly high. A person living in close contact with the environment was completely defenseless against the forces of nature that could strike at any moment. Rain could flood temporary camps, wash away supplies, and even carry people away. Rivers that burst their banks became insurmountable obstacles, separating tribes and making hunting and gathering impossible. After such cataclysms, people were left without shelter, food, or fire, which made them vulnerable to the cold and wild animals. The loss of supplies meant starvation, which in turn weakened the entire tribe and made it easy prey for disease and predators. Torrential rains, which in modern times only interfere with a walk, were a real disaster for primitive man. They could flood temporary camps, wash away supplies, and even carry people away. Living in lowlands or near rivers was a constant game with death. Rivers that burst their banks became an insurmountable obstacle, dividing tribes and making hunting and gathering impossible. After such cataclysms, people were left without shelter, food, or fire, which made them vulnerable to the cold and wild animals. The loss of supplies meant starvation, which in turn weakened the entire tribe and made it easy prey for disease and predators. The other side of the invisible war was drought. Unlike sudden floods, drought was a slow and painful death. It burned pastures, destroyed water sources, and forced people to leave their homes. In search of moisture and food, entire tribes ventured into dangerous and unknown lands, where new threats awaited them. Forest fires caused by lightning or prolonged heat were another scourge. They destroyed forests, drove away animals, and left behind a charred desert unfit for life. Fire, which was an ally to humans, could turn against them at any moment, sweeping away everything in its path. In addition to seasonal cataclysms, people constantly faced unpredictable phenomena. Sudden cold snaps and unexpected snowfalls that came earlier than usual could catch tribes off guard, leaving them without time to stock up on everything they needed. Earthquakes, landslides, and volcanic eruptions, although not as frequent, were a real wrath of the gods for primitive man. They could destroy caves, collapse rocks, and permanently change the landscape, making it uninhabitable. People could not predict these phenomena, which meant they were completely defenseless against them. In their understanding, these were not natural processes, but manifestations of supernatural forces that required appeasement and sacrifices. Thus, fear of the inexplicable power of nature shaped their beliefs and rituals, which were the only available tools for combating what could not be controlled. Life in conditions of constant natural threat also shaped the culture of primitive man. Observing natural phenomena, the cycles of rain and drought, and the movements of animals became a necessity of life. This knowledge was the only shield in this invisible war. Those who survived passed on stronger genes, and more importantly, accumulated experience to their descendants. It was natural selection in action, a process that shaped humanity, making it more resilient, but also leaving traces of countless battles on its body and in its genes. Every victory over the elements was the result of adaptation and accumulated knowledge. This struggle continued for millennia. Only with the development of technology and the creation of durable dwellings, clothing, and tools was man able to gradually reclaim part of his space from nature. But until that moment, primitive people remained prisoners of their environment, constantly fighting for survival in a world where the slightest rain or the slightest gust of wind could be deadly. Ultimately, the greatest threat to primitive humans was not wild nature, but themselves. When they transitioned from a nomadic to a sedentary lifestyle, they created ideal conditions for the spread of disease. They began to live in denser communities, which led to the spread of disease from person to person. They came into contact with new species of animals, which led to the emergence of new diseases. And they began to live in conditions where hygiene was almost impossible. This turning point in human history, known as the Neolithic Revolution, had far-reaching and not always positive consequences. The domestication of animals played a fateful role. Humans began to live side by side with cows, pigs, sheep, and poultry. This created ideal conditions for zoonoses, diseases transmitted from animals to humans. For example, smallpox, measles, and tuberculosis are believed to have originated from viruses circulating among domestic livestock. Interaction with animals, which provided humans with a stable source of food and resources, also opened the door to new, previously unknown pathogens. The human immune system, which had never encountered these viruses and bacteria before, was completely defenseless. This led to massive epidemics that devastated entire settlements and negated all the advantages of a sedentary lifestyle. Sedentary lifestyles also created a new, even more insidious problem: the accumulation of waste. In nomadic tribes, waste was simply left behind and quickly disposed of by nature. In permanent settlements, waste accumulated, polluting water sources and soil. Fecks, garbage, and food scraps attracted insects and rodents, which in turn spread disease. The lack of sewage systems and basic hygiene led to the spread of gastrointestinal diseases, such as cholera and dysentery. The dirty water that people drank became a breeding ground for deadly bacteria. With the advent of agriculture and a sedentary lifestyle, social stratification also emerged. Food surpluses appeared, leading to the emergence of traders, craftsmen, and ultimately, rulers. But dependence on the harvest made society extremely vulnerable. Crop failure, drought, or pest infestation could cause mass starvation. In a nomadic society, when faced with famine, people could simply move to another area. In a settled society, however, which depended on a specific piece of land, famine became a real disaster, weakening the population and making it even more susceptible to disease. Thus, the transition to a sedentary lifestyle, which we now consider to be the greatest step forward, had its dark side. It created conditions for new threats against which humans had neither immunity nor knowledge. It was an invisible but merciless blow to humanity. However, it was precisely these difficulties that forced people to evolve. They began to look for ways to combat disease, creating primitive medicine and hygiene practices. This invisible war against new threats created by humans themselves ultimately became a stimulus for the development of science, medicine, and social institutions, which after thousands of years allowed humanity to control these diseases and create the civilization we know today. Thus, we see that life in the Stone Age was full of not only visible dangers, but also invisible ones. Diseases that seem commonplace to us today could be deadly to primitive people. It was a world where only the strongest survived, and where even a minor illness could lead to a sad end. It was a world where people were defenseless against invisible enemies. What other topics related to primitive people would you like us to explore? For example, how did they build their homes? Or how did they communicate? Write your suggestions in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss any new videos.